with this, I'll start with a case of tall stature. So starting with the demographic details of my patient. My patient is. Should I continue?
नहीं पीना है उसको, सब निकाल रहा है साइड से.
Should I continue, sir?
दे दो.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, can I just request anybody who's not speaking to just ensure that their microphones are muted? At the moment, perhaps only Dr. Jasmeet's microphone can be switched on. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So my patient, Mr. SK, he's a 42-year-old gentleman. He's unmarried. He belongs to Saharanpur from UP in India. He's educated up to the high school, and he's a farmer by occupation. The age at first presentation was 37 years. So he presented to us with history of arthralgia since the age of 30 years. These are non-inflammatory with bilateral symmetric involvement of the large joints and also with history of low backache. There was associated swelling of both knee joints. By the time he presented, he had developed deformity of the right knee. The other complaint was the history of facial asymmetry, which was also noticed around 30 years of age. This was associated with prominence of the right half of the face. In view of worsening of these complaints, he first sought medical advice at the age of 37 years. So on probing further, we found that he had history of features suggestive of growth hormone excess in the form of excessive height gain, which began about 10 years of age. There was not associated history of precocity. He continued to grow tall till the age of 30 years. There was associated acral enlargement, history of excessive sweating, jaw protrusion, widening of the space between the teeth. There was history of obstructive sleep apnea, chronic constipation. He also had history of recurrent acneiform eruptions on the back and the thighs, which would heal by scarring. So in this scenario of features suggestive of growth hormone excess with likely arthritis and presence of facial asymmetry, we did not get a history of headache, visual deficit, seizures, hypertension, past history of diabetes, neck swelling, renal stone disease, nor was there any history of nevi, abnormal pigmentation, hearing abnormality, bony pains, muscle weakness, or fractures. So his personal history was suggestive of history of chronic moderate smoking with a smoking index of 225. He had history of decreased libido, erectile dysfunction. He was a single child and the family history was non-contributory. So coming to the examination, his anthropometry was suggestive of tall stature. His height was 196 centimeters, which is above the 97th percentile, plus 2.7 STS. He was obese as per the Asian criteria of obesity. His vitals were suggestive of a pulse rate of 60 per minute. He was normotensive. The systemic examination, the CNS exam, as a part of CNS examination, his visual acuity was done, which was 6/18 bilateral. Visual fields were normal by confrontation. Fundus was suggestive of bilateral, mild temporal disc pallor, and rest of the systemic examination was non-contributory. The head-to-toe examination again revealed evidence, features suggestive of growth hormone excess in the form of prominent supraorbital ridges. There was also hypertelorism. There was prominence of the right half of the face. There was prognathism, dental malocclusions, increased spacing between the teeth. He had acanthosis nigricans grade 2, no skin tags, however. He had developed scoliosis and right genovalgum. The second picture here shows the evidence of those recurrent scarring acneiform lesions on the back, which he had developed over the last 5 years. So coming to the baseline investigations, which were done in 2016, his complete blood count was suggestive of pancytopenia, on the evaluation of which he was found to have folate deficiency. His biochemical profile was suggestive of increased ALP, and there was evidence of dyslipidemia. The calcium profile was suggestive of low phosphate levels against a vitamin D of 23.6 nanogram per ml with IPTH of 19.3. And there was, so based on this workup, we went ahead and we calculated the TMP-GFR, so which came out to be low in this case. Further on, we did, in view of low TMP-GFR, which was suggestive of renal phosphate wasting, we did an FGF 23. So this was done with a C-terminal assay by ELISA. This also came out to be elevated, 316.9 relative units per ml. So coming to the hormonal profile, his IGF-1 was 896 nanogram per ml, and GHGT was non-suppressible with another GH of 70.8 nanogram per ml. There was evidence of hyperprolactinemia, and he had a cortisol of 165 against an ACTH of 71.65, probably reflective of the GH inhibitory action on 11 beta HSP1. He had normal thyroid functions. There was evidence of secondary hypogonadism, and he was also detected to have diabetes. ECG was suggestive of sinus bradycardia with VPCs, and the 2D echo was suggestive of an ejection fraction of 60% with evidence of concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. This was the baseline ECG. The ultrasonography also revealed evidence of thyromegaly as well as testicular microlithiasis. Coming to the radiology, so in this X-ray of the skull, we can see there is widening of the sella, and the underlying sphenoid bone shows evidence of sclerosis. And the second X-ray is that of bilateral knee joints. So this is suggested if we, in this second X-ray of the bilateral knee joints, we can see that in both the knees, there's loss of joint space, there's narrowing of the joint space, and this presence of osteophytes. So in this given scenario, this is a late stage of osteoarthropathy in the setting of growth hormone excess. Secondly, there was evidence of bowing of the tibia on the right side, and this right tibia is showing evidence of sclerotic lesions as well as lytic lesions. Similarly, the other bilateral femur and the other tibia is showing areas of lytic lesions. So we had sclerotic as well as lytic lesions. There was evidence of an advanced osteoarthropathy with osteophytes, and there was bowing of the tibia. So moving on to the next image, that is of the CMRI sella. So in this, as pointed by the blue arrow, there was the pituitary was normal. Underneath, there was an evidence of a solid, complex cystic lesion in this involving the sphenoid bone and the sinus. In the T2 image, also we can see the normal pituitary. The third image of the sagittal section also reveals a presence of a ground glassing involvement and a heterogeneous lesion involving the frontal bone with mild indentation of the underlying frontal cortex. In the intracellular region also, we can see there's a heterogeneous lesion. The sella is seen separate from this lesion, and there's presence of a posterior pituitary bright spot. So further on the NCCT head bone reconstruction images, here we can appreciate there's evidence of sclerotic changes involving the greater wing, the body, as well as the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And also, if we compare the right ramus of the mandible to the left side, we can see the right ramus is enlarged with evidence of heterogeneity. So further, an MDP bone scan was done in this patient. So both the anterior images as well as the posterior images are suggestive of increased osteoblastic activity, predominantly on the right side, involving the right frontal bone, right mandible, there was a right sphenoid, right femur, right pubic bone, and part of the right tibia. So this was suggestive of polyostotic fibrous dysplasia. So with this background, our diagnosis was that of McKeown-Albright syndrome with polyostotic fibrous dysplasia, acrogigantism, secondary diabetes with acromegalic osteoarthropathy, acromegalic cardiomyopathy as suggested by the presence of left ventricular hypertrophy and cardiac conduction abnormalities in the form of multifocal VPCs. And there was evidence of secondary hypogonadism as well as hypocortisolism. In the setting of this, in the absence of a visualized adenoma, here this hypogonadism can be attributed to the presence of hyperprolactinemia, and there was evidence of FGF23 mediated hyperphosphatemia. So even in the absence of visualization of an adenoma, in this particular case, we went ahead with total hypophysectomy. So there were financial concerns with regards to the use of medical management. The intraoperative course, during the intraoperative course, the route of the surgery, initially it was microscopic TSS, but later on it had endoscopic TSS had to be resorted to because of the finding of hyperostosis in the sphenoid. And the intraoperative findings revealed the presence of a moderately vascular lesion, which was removed from the sinus cavity, and thereafter the patient was subject to total hypophysectomy. Postoperatively, the patient had transient DI followed by SIADH. The growth hormone levels in the postoperative period have been consistently high in the first week, going up to 64.8 nanogram per ml. Histopathology was suggestive of pituitary hyperplasia as well as presence of pituitary adenoma. On IHC, 80% of the tumor cells showed staining for both growth hormone as well as prolactin. In view of secondary hypothyroidism, hypocortisolism, So he was discharged on thyroxine as well as hydrocortisone supplementation and was advised to continue cabergoline, and he continued to require metformin in the postoperative period. He was also given intravenous zoledronate 5 mg during this admission. These are the slides from the histopathology. So here we can see in the first slide, these nests of the pituitary, they have lost the reticulin framework surrounding them. So this is suggestive of adenoma. In the second picture, there are these nests of the pituitary cells. They are surrounded by some ill-defined reticulin framework around them. So this picture is suggestive of hyperplasia. So on subsequent follow-up, this patient has never gone into biochemical remission. In between, he was advised to continue cabergoline, and there was a loss to follow-up in between. And after 4.5 years during this current admission, his growth hormone was 7.88 nanogram per ml, IGA1 of 184. This normal IGA1 could be explained by multiple factors: secondary hypogonadism, hypothyroidism, and the repeat MRI SELA done during this admission was suggestive of a normal pituitary, and in the infracellular location, there was persistence of the fibrous dysplasia lesion. So besides lack of biochemical remission, this patient had now also presented with symptoms of left heart failure for 3 years. And his echo done at this time was suggestive of BCMP with an ejection fraction of 15 to 20%. He was subject to a myocardial perfusion scintigraphy, which was suggestive of reduced perfusion in the inferior wall in a part of the basal inferolateral segment of left ventricle, such that there was a presence of an 8% of the LV myocardium in the inferolateral basal segment was non-viable. CT coronary angiography, however, did not show any evidence of obstructive CAD. Besides worsening of cardiomyopathy, he was also found to have persistent hypophosphatemia. His TMP-GFR we repeated, which was again low. Subsequently, we did FGF23 levels again, which came out to be elevated, more than what was seen last time. This time it was 548.20 relative units per ml. Bone turnover markers were suggestive of increased bone resorption. This time we did, instead of MDP bone scan, we resorted to a sodium fluoride PET scan. So this was also suggestive of lesions involving the right side of the body, the right frontal sphenoid, right mandible, right side of the femur. But at this, there was involvement of the lumbar vertebra as well. But at this time, it also picked up lesions involving the left side of the ribs. So in the previous MDP image, there was some evidence on the right side, not on the left side. And there was also involvement of the right of the left femur in the current scan. So as far as the current status of this patient is concerned, currently he had lack of biochemical remission. He had complications in the form of cardiomyopathy, and he had persistent hormonal deficiencies with secondary hypothyroidism, hypogonadism, hypocortisolism, and there was persistence of the FD lesions with persistent FGF23 mediated hypophosphatemia. So as far as the management of this patient is concerned, so we've had a limited choice. So we've offered him IMRT, and for the interim period, we are planning to offer him medical management with SRL therapy, which we are trying to arrange. And we've also given him zoledronate injection, and the management of the, cardiomyopathy has been alluded to by using ARBs, beta blockers, mineralocorticoid antagonists, and diuretics. But he's also a candidate for ICD, considering his low EF and his presence of baseline VPCs. So coming to the points of discussion in this case, starting with the first point, that is the association of acromegaly in McCune-Albright syndrome. So the oldest association of acromegaly in McCune-Albright syndrome probably dates back to 1876, when Mr. Thomas Hassler, who was 25 years of age at that time, died after achieving a final adult height of around 2.35 meters, which would be 7 feet and 8.5 inches. And he belonged to Germany and was popularly known as the Tegernsee giant. The average adult height of Germans is around 1.68 meters. So it was his skeleton was preserved in the University of Munich for almost 100 years. And then later on, with the development of advanced radiological methods as well as histology, the nature of his disease was characterized. And it was described as a case of polyostotic fibrous dysplasia with evidence of hypersomatotropism. But by this time, though the McCune-Albright syndrome had been described in 1936 by Donovan McCune as well as Fuller Albright, the same description was not used for this patient because the original definition consisted of a triad of polyostotic fibrous dysplasia with café au lait and precocious puberty, which would not result in tall stature. So it was only later on that the other endocrinopathies associated with McCune-Albright syndrome were characterized. So coming to acromegaly, the prevalence of acromegaly in McCune-Albright syndrome has been considered is reported to be 20 to 30% and vice versa, 1% or less than 1%. The mean age at presentation in these cases is 24.4 years, which is younger than that of sporadic acromegaly being around 40 years. And the craniofacial effects of acromegaly can be masked by deformities of McCune-Albright syndrome. Final height is generally normal, even with precocity. Gigantism is reported in only 7% of the cases, and that happens in association with hypogonadism. And the skull-based fibrous dysplasia is particularly common. Adenoma has been found in 50% of the patients only, considering the mutation to be involved the somatotropes diffusely, and 72% of these adenomas are macroadenomas. And hyperprolactinemia has been consistently, distinctly more commonly described in setting of MAS as compared to classic acromegaly, with a prevalence reported to be 92% versus 40% in sporadic cases of acromegaly. So coming to the treatment aspects, firstly, regarding surgery, surgery has been considered to be particularly challenging because of skull-based cranial dysplasia, and also that these FD lesions are very vascular, so there may be a risk of hemorrhage intraoperatively. And the procedure of choice is considered to be total hypophysectomy, again, given the diffuse nature of the disease rather than adenomectomy. And as far as the surgical outcomes are concerned, results in these settings have been reported to be inferior to that seen in classic acromegaly. So this data of 12% control rates has come from a review by Philip Janssen, published in 2014. And this was from patients, 25 patients of acromegaly and McCune-Albright syndrome who underwent surgery out of a total number of 112. So in that data set, 12% control rates have been described. So relatively recent data, this was a retrospective study from China. So they had 52 patients of McCune-Albright syndrome and a 25% prevalence of acromegaly in them, with 13 patients of MAS having acromegaly. 9% of these patients had an adenoma identified on imaging, and 4 out of these patients had evidence of skull-based cranial dysplasia. So 6 out of these patients achieved clinical complete remission. So this may suggest that with improvement in surgical technique over time and with the use of neuronavigation protocols, the outcomes may be actually better with surgery in these patients. Now, medical management, it's had a wide application in this setting, especially with regards to imaging negative cases. As far as the response to somatostatin receptor ligands is concerned, the response rates have shown 32% biochemical control, which is similar to sporadic acromegaly if you consider a stricter cutoff of growth hormone less than 1 nanogram per ml. And response rates have been higher in microadenomas as compared to macroadenomas. As far as dopamine agonist therapy is concerned, it's got a limited efficacy. And as far as pegvisomant is concerned, the response rates have been shown to be around 76.9%. So this is similar to the data from ACRO study, which provided a real world data of 2090 patients with acromegaly treated with pegvisomant, as opposed to the clinical trial data, which had shown a 90% rate of normalization of IGF, probably because of their stricter titration schedule. So in the algorithm of medical management, SRL therapy remains the first choice, probably because of the convenience. Addition of pegvisomant to SRL therapy, this is resorted to in the case of incomplete response to SRL therapy. So if you have a less than 20% normalization of IGF-1, and this would have the added advantage of controlling tumor growth and minimizing the frequent injections by resorting to a once-weekly protocol of pegvisomant with low-dose SRL therapy. So as far as radiotherapy is concerned, this has also been reported to have a limited efficacy. So control rates of 13% were reported in one series. And the other concern regarding radiotherapy is that of triggering a sarcomatous transformation in patients with McCune-Albright syndrome. So this kind of a transformation has been reported with a prevalence of 1%. So this is from the NIH cohort of 250 patients. But there is a little bit of lack of clarity regarding the risk attributable to irradiation. So in one series, out of 6 patients who had sarcoma in McCune-Albright syndrome, 3 cases had history of previous irradiation and rest did not. So though the risk cannot be ruled out, so if radiotherapy is to be resorted to, then it is recommended that proton beam or gamma knife may be safer if required. So in our setting, we plan to offer IMRT. So this is because of financial constraints. And the other factor in patients with McCune-Albright syndrome and acromegaly is that GH excess may be another risk factor for malignant transformation. So coming to growth hormone and phosphate and hypophosphatemia in this patient, a little bit about phosphate homeostasis. So we know that the main hormonal regulators of phosphate are PTH, FGF23, and 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So PTH and FGF23, both of them, by inhibition of NPT2A and NPT2C, inhibits the renal reabsorption of phosphate. 1,25D, on the other hand, facilitates the dietary absorption of phosphate mainly by the active route by enhancing the activity of NPT2B, and also would replenish the blood pool levels of phosphate by enhancing osteoclastic bone resorption in the setting of phosphate deficiency, which would mobilize phosphorus from the bone by means of PIT1. Now, regarding the interaction of growth hormone and phosphate, this interaction of growth hormone and phosphate is usually more apparent in the setting of growth hormone excess and also during juvenile growth. Their growth hormone would help in the retention of phosphorus from the kidney, and this is to allow adjustments to a period of excess, net bone formation. So in the setting of growth hormone excess also, growth hormone has been shown to cause an increase in TMP-GFR, thereby enhancing renal reabsorption. And this process is it's IgA1 mediated, which results in the elevation of NaPi2A, and increased calcitriol levels because of the action of growth hormone per se may contribute to the hyperphosphatemia, to increased levels of phosphate in the setting. People have tried to investigate the role of phosphorus as a marker of remission in patients with acromegaly, and it's been seen in one study that the levels of phosphorus correlate with a lack of remission also. Then acromegaly, coming to acromegaly and hypophosphatemia, as in this case, so the possibilities in this setting could have been MEN1, sporadic PHPT, or MAS. So regarding MEN1, we know the prevalence of 30 to 40% of patients with MEN1 have pituitary adenomas, with 5 to 25% being GH secreting. Vice versa, the prevalence of MEN1 in pituitary adenomas across all subtypes has been reported to be 4.8 and 7.7%. Regarding sporadic PHPT, in one series, the prevalence was reported to be 6.1%, which is much higher than the prevalence of PHPT in the general population of around 0.86% and 1.5% in the elderly. So this may reflect the trophic action of growth hormone on the parathyroid cells. The other possibility, as in our case, is McCune-Albright syndrome. So coming to the hypophosphatemia and McCune-Albright syndrome, the mechanisms implicated include GS-alpha activation in the abnormal osteocytes in the fibrous dysplasia lesions, which result in FGF23 overproduction. But this happens only if there's a substantial skeletal involvement, because along with increase in FGF23 production, there's also GS-alpha activation, which results in activation of furin, which results in cleavage of FGF23. So in order to have a net FGF23 overproduction, we need to have a substantial burden of skeletal disease. The other mechanism could be the constitutive activation of PTH-coupled G-alpha cells in the proximal renal tubule. So regarding the treatment, so this would be managed with calcitriol and phosphorus supplementation, just like other cases of hypophosphatemic osteomalacia. Regarding the role of GH control in this setting, so we know that GH excess can mask the hypophosphatemia in the setting of McCune-Albright syndrome. GH has been used as an off-label drug for hypophosphatemic osteomalacia also because of its phosphorus retaining properties. But the other thing that merits consideration in this current case is that GH also has a role in expansion of FD lesions, which may itself result in overproduction of FGF23. So usually in fibrous dysplasia, most of the lesions are established by adolescents, and during adulthood, they may actually have a waning course. So coming back to the given scenario, this patient, he's had a lack of biochemical remission. He's had persistent growth hormone excess. And regarding the FD lesions, he's had a persistence of the same, with even new lesions apparent on the subsequent scan, with persistent hypophosphatemia, with persistent FGF23 levels, which are higher than previously documented. So this may underscore the fact that in this particular setting of McCune-Albright syndrome, the GH excess, effect of GH excess on the expansion of FD lesions may actually dominate and may result in net hypophosphatemia. So GH control, bringing down GH levels with octreotide therapy would be useful in this scenario. The other drug which has been tried for the management of hypophosphatemia osteomalacia, that is bevacizumab. So this awaits investigation in this setting. Coming on to the medical management of fibrous dysplasia, surgical management can be, it's difficult, especially of the craniofacial deformities because they're subject to regrowth, especially in this setting. So medical management is directed against increased osteoclastogenesis and also IL-6 pathway, which in turn leads on to increased osteoclastogenesis. So regarding the role of bisphosphonates, they have been shown to decrease bone resorption markers, decrease pain, but no improvement in histomorphometry or radiology. The use of bisphosphonate in our current case may also raise questions with regards to the risk of atrial fibrillation, given that he has a dilated cardiomyopathy. But regarding the reports of association of bisphosphonates with atrial fibrillation, it's a mixed picture. The initial trial was the Horizon trial, which was suggestive of association of atrial fibrillation with bisphosphonates, but the subsequent Horizon recurrent fracture trial did not reveal. And studies from Europe also did not find this a significant association with bisphosphonate use in atrial fibrillation. Further, people have tried to use bisphosphonates to reduce cardiovascular mortality, given the fact that it can reduce arterial calcification, improve endothelial dysfunction. But again, in this scenario, again, no conclusive benefit has been seen. Secondly, regarding the role of denosumab, it has been shown to decrease bone turnover, but the effect of the concern with the use of denosumab is a post-discontinuation rebound. And the other concern with the use of both the therapies is the risk of osteonecrosis of the jaw. So in one series, it's been reported that in the setting of fibrous dysplasia, the risk of ONJ can be as high as 5%, which is much, much higher than what is reported for the use of bisphosphonates in the setting of osteoporosis. So this may be actually similar to the risk of ONJ that is seen with bisphosphonate use in the setting of malignancies, where they report the risk ranging from 1 to 10%. And regarding the role of targeting IL-6 pathway, so tocilizumab has been reported to be useful in case reports. There's another study which is ongoing, and the results of the same are awaited. So coming to the conclusion, so acromegaly has a prevalence of 20 to 30% in McCune-Albright syndrome. Diagnosis can be delayed, especially by craniofacial dysplasia. Management of acromegaly can be challenging given the difficulty of surgery, as well as the limited efficacy of medical management and the controversial role of radiotherapy. GH control in the setting of hypophosphatemia represents a double-edged sword, but where do we tip the balance? Given the effect of growth hormone on expansion of the FD lesions, so this would favor targeting a low growth hormone level in these patients. Thank you.